Secret Circle.
Welcome to the Secret Circle with me, Dr. Luke Deckard, the podcast where I chat with authors, filmmakers, musicians, and more about the art of their craft and let you in on some of their secrets. Today's guest is forensics expert Jim Fraser, and today he's going to let you in on some of his secrets. Jim, welcome to the show.
Hi, Luke. Should I say Dr. Deckard?
Either way works. I'll take both.
Yeah, okay. And so you should.
Yes. I'm glad we finally got you here. For anyone, who obviously wasn't here. We were having some technical issues with browsers and things, but we've made it work.
Yeah.
Technology is our bitch. So yeah, Jim. I'm always fascinated by your work. You have a couple of books and a lot of research material on the stuff that you do, and it's incredibly fascinating. Working within forensics and crime and real life crime as opposed to the fictional stuff that a lot of people I know and I myself do. But I feel like there's an art to your to your job as well. This path that you've chosen. But I'm interested, firstly, to kind of find out what made you decide to go into this. Take us back to young Jim, and let us know kind of what was the inspiration to go into this field, to become a forensics expert and work with crimes and cases and all that kind of stuff.
Okay, I get asked this question a lot, and it's going to be a very disappointing answer. Because in the 70s, when I graduated, I should say the late 70s, not that old, there weren't many jobs around. And I trained to be a biochemist specializing in clinical work, but there weren't any jobs in clinical work. And I'm sure my memory's not completely accurate. My recollection is that I was only offered one job, and that was a job in the Metropolitan Police Forensic Science Lab in London. So I took the only job I was offered. And that's where I started.
So this is we're talking you said late 70s?
Yeah. In 78 I started in London.
78. Okay, so what was working with the police in the 70s in London like?
Well, probably just the way you imagine it, to be honest, if you get any kind of sense of police developed. I mean, there was some quite smart cops there, and it was a really big lab. So in kind of scientific terms, it was the place to work in the UK, and many people would say is the place to work in the world. So I really cut my teeth there. Monthly trips to Old Bailey. Going to crime scenes, regularly giving testimony, dealing with really tricky cases and tricky lawyers. The cops could be a mix. You had the usual lags, blags, and slags, and all that fantastic London rhyming slang. He's had that away on his toes and all that stuff. And yeah, they did talk like that. It was. And then at the other end, when got what the more senior cops, in fact, I was just writing about this the other day, the superintendents who were the SIOs, the senior investigating officers, the rank that investigated homicide, not typical for the rest of the UK, but then the Met is not typical of the rest of the UK. They lots of these guys wore pinstripe suits and full cutaway collars and very unstated ties, and looking back on it now, and quite aggressive aftershave as well, I should add, to bring out all the senses. And a lot of they dressed like kind of lawyers or kind of senior businessmen, which I imagine that's what I probably aspired to be. It was a very different world from now, to give you a summary of that answer. And a lot of the cliches that you see on the TV. I tell you, if you watched, I don't recall the title of this program, but if you watched the recent drama documentary about the Brinksmart robbery, it was I thought that was fantastically realistic. I mean, the language spot on, the attitudes were spot on. And I remember that case really well. I didn't work on it, but I knew the scientist who literally sat next to me and a desk right next to me who dealt with it. And so watch, I'm trying to remember what it's called, something gold. That will give you a pretty accurate reflection of what the Met was like in the 70s.
Yeah, I think the show was called The Gold. I think that might be
the gold.
Brinks
Yeah,
Met.
I would. I mean, I was flooded with nostalgia as I watched it because it's a great story anyway, and everything else just seemed to be the characters, the people they picked to play the various characters just seemed to fit perfectly.
Nice,
including all the standard misogyny and all the rest of it. So
right. So it's I haven't seen it yet, but I feel like I should watch this show.
You should definitely watch it.
Yeah. What because there is kind of a resurgence, a little bit, not resurgence, but there's a trend rather of doing sort of 80s and I guess now 90s police procedurals. That's becoming vogue because we're now so far beyond the 80s and 90s that now that's now a historical period. But which is a bit depressing. But what was it about, what was it about London at the time, and even maybe so today, that makes that such a pivotal and important place for the work that you do?
Well, everything that makes London that bit different from everywhere else in the UK. It's bigger, it's more diverse. There's more crime going on. More people up to all sorts of different things. I was working in a very big lab. I mean, the labs I worked in subsequently, were quite small. The lab in Glasgow, for example, I think had about 50 people in it. I didn't work in Glasgow. I worked in Edinburgh, which was even smaller. But even there was 300 staff in the Met lab. It was the biggest lab in Europe. So there was a constant stream. A very diverse range of crimes, from violence, sexual crime, organized crime, money laundering. I mean, some of the organized crime I dealt with, without a doubt, is what kind of taught me my trade. So, you'll need to deal with a few kind of professional cases a few cases involving professional bank robbers. These are guys who, in those days, I mean, I say this quite a lot, but these are the days when people stole cash. Now you don't need to steal cash; you just skim credit cards or get involved in some kind of digital fraud. But these guys went masks, shotguns, handguns, flaming cars, shots into ceilings, and leaving with loot, and then dumping the car, setting the car on fire, having another car. It's all classic, old style heist stuff. But because they were professional criminals, they had really good lawyers, and because they went multi-handed. I mean, the day I remember when I think about giving evidence in one of these cases, I'm standing in the witness box, and in front of me, in the dock, there are 4 people. In front of them, there are 4 leading counsels, 4 QCs, 4 juniors, 4 sets of solicitors.
Jeez.
And you're there hours on end where multiple defenses are put to you. Almost every defense conceivable is put to you by different people, which wouldn't happen in a normal case because a judge wouldn't allow it. You can't say I wasn't there, and if I was there, it wasn't me anyway. You can say I wasn't there or it wasn't me. But if you've got 4 people, the first one can say I wasn't there. The second one can say it wasn't me, it was him. The third one can say, we don't think you're an expert in the evidence you're giving in. and the
Right.
next one can say, we don't care if you're an expert or not. The science you're using is crap. So you
Right.
get questions. I'd missed out, of course, the critical defense in all of these cases, which is the evidence was planted, because
Yeah.
you're dealing with a flying squad here, and the flying squads are, when I think back on it, and it's only when I think back on it, I think the squad are as tricky there as everybody believed them to be.
Mm.
And that's why my evidence was so important, because
Yeah.
I was one of the few people there that they thought was telling the truth. And although they didn't treat me like that, they treated me as if I was just one of the team. And
Yeah.
you would get regularly abused and accused of being incompetent or unscientific or
Yeah.
just, racist on one instance.
Right.
Well, so when you're doing all that kind of stuff, if you can get through that, and not everybody did, there were some people in the lab who were senior to me, so I was only in my 20s, who refused to do these cases because they were too difficult. But once you get the hang of that, I'm not saying for a second it ever gets easy.
Yeah.
But you kind of learn what you're doing, and then after that, you're kind of reasonable. Although you always go into court, I always go into court a bit kind of anxious, because you just don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
Once you've done a few of these trials and you're prepared for them properly, you can, within reason, you can take on anything.
Yeah, I love that. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that in a way, because it's like I was saying earlier. There is an artistry to the work that you're doing, and part of that is you had to learn to deal with those situations and get better at that particular part of the job.
You have to learn the craft.
Yes.
I mean, it's
so
a
what
skill,
is how did you teach yourself the craft or learn that? How did you do that?
Well, the first thing is the answer to most problems like that and other wider problems is, if you're surrounded by good people, you're in a good place to start with. And I had around me some fantastically skilled scientists and expert witnesses. Now, some of these people are far braver than I was. Some of these people quite liked an argument. I didn't go looking for arguments. I would basically hope I'd get in there, I'd give my evidence. There might be a bit of tussle over exactly what it meant. There might be a bit of discussion about whether I was right or not. But I didn't go looking for arguments. But there was I worked with a couple of people who were so skilled at this, they enjoyed the arguments. But the thing is, learn from them. And one of my rules is never pick an argument in court. Just don't do it.
Right.
Because there's a very, very high chance you lose it. Because the people on the other side of that argument are people who argue for a living.
Yes.
That's what they do. That's what lawyers do.
Yes.
They argue for a living. But you go to them and you say, this is my position on this. I've been arrested for this, but this is my position. And they figure out the best way to present that, to diminish any other possibilities, and so on and so forth. So learn that you learn the really simple rules. Get there on time. Make sure you've got your file. Make sure you know what's in the file. I've missed out the first rule. Know your job. Yeah. This is not a trade to get into if you don't know what you're talking about. Yeah. Bluster in court doesn't work. I'm a bit upset with the Donald Trump trials at the minute. Donald, he's going to jail. All that kind of grandstanding and crap that Trump comes out with will not work in the witness box. It just will not work. And you can't go. So the basics are know your job, and that includes knowing what an expert witness is, not just a scientist, but a scientist who goes to court. So you need to understand a bit of law. Get there on time. Dress for the part. Everybody thinks you should be dressed in a suit. That includes women. Dress for the part. Answer the question, not the question you would like to answer, not the question you think is coming next.
So, like all of our MPs.
Well, these guys are they recognize the question and then say what they want. So answer the question. When you've answered the question, shut up. And don't say anything else. Then it gets increasingly subtle as you go on. Then it's about the choice of words that you use in the question. And there's a critical difference between not being... The trick is not to be right all the time. I mean, this is my take on it.
Right.
I aim to be right all the time, but sometimes you can never be quite certain of that. What you mustn't do is be wrong. And there's a subtle difference. There's a subtle difference between being not wrong and being right. So if you nail yourself down, if you say the blade of a knife was 106.3 millimeters long. In certain circumstances, you've set yourself for a fall because you probably can't measure it that accurately. So if somebody picks you up on that tiny little point and says, was exactly 106.3, you then have to say kind of yes or no to that. Now, I avoid all that by basically saying the knife was approximately 106 millimeters long.
Right.
And if they said, is it exactly 106? And I would say, well, it depends on what equipment you use to measure it. But, using a ruler in an everyday thing, it was 106 millimeters long. It doesn't matter, right? These are games to try and catch out.
Right.
And the general tactics that a lawyer would use would be, I guess there's a number of options, but I'll describe three of them. The first fork in the road that a lawyer faces is, am I going to cross-examine this witness? Why do they have to make that choice? Well, cross-examining the witness might make the situation worse for them. If my evidence is very good and they don't know me, I mean, they might know me, but it's less likely. And in London, in Scotland, the lawyers got to know who you were because it's a smaller country. In London, you did sometimes bump the same, but not so often. Well, often the same defense lawyers, but same prosecution lawyers. So the first is this evidence. Should I argue with it? Because if I argue with it, it may well be that if there's a skilled witness, that they will actually come out sounding stronger.
Right.
And the jury will think the evidence is stronger. So very often what happens when you get very good evidence is the prosecution leads their side of the case and the defense don't ask any questions at all.
Right.
Because to ask questions is simply to reiterate in the mind how significant the evidence is. So that's the first question. Next one is, if I am going to argue with him, what am I going to argue with him about? It's generally a bad idea to argue about facts. A blade that's 106 millimeters long. Better to argue about something subjective, like this knife could have made this cut. In a piece of, or this shoe could have made this mark, or this blood pattern could be explained by this. That's subjective. It's a bit more squidgy. And the kind of question, the only question a lawyer needs to ask in those circumstances, and they regularly do, is if I said, it's highly likely the explanation for this blood pattern is this, they might only be one question, which might be along the lines of, is it possible that this is the explanation? And that's an alternative. And I will, in certain circumstances, I will have to say, yes, that is possible, but my explanation is the most likely. Now, all they need is me saying that's possible. Then when they sum up to the jury, they will say, heard what Mr. Fraser said, this is possible.
Yeah.
They ignore the fact that I said it was likely, Right. It's all about that. So I'll kind of stop there or pause there, but you can see it gets increasingly subtle as you go into it. That includes how you write your report.
Right.
Because that in the witness box, although it's a bad idea, you can adjust words. You can say, well, let me explain it again. Of course, it's in black and white in print. It's much harder to adjust.
Yes.
So you've got to do a lot of thinking. You've got to do a lot of thinking I mean, the general rule that I use is when you write your report and when you're and you don't need to sit and think about this because it kind of becomes automatic. There should never be a question you get asked in court that you haven't already anticipated.
Right.
It just shouldn't happen. Or any kind of crazy explanation. You should have thought about that. And it becomes kind of routine, and you don't literally need to think about it because they're kind of sitting at the back of your mind. But lawyers are quite good at coming up, even in those circumstances, with questions that you didn't anticipate. So there's a certain amount of live performance there, and it is a performance. You know that you think, I didn't think you would say that. What's the answer to that? Right. Then again, you have to answer it live. You have to get the words right. You have to get the balance right, because you might be in the middle of a discussion about something else, and you need to, in that moment, find words that aren't going to hold you to ransom later on.
Yeah. I can imagine that being incredibly difficult, which means you really have to be on point this whole time. So,
go
on.
And it's exhausting.
I can imagine.
You do have to be on point, and it is. Even if you're only in court for half an hour, you come out. You don't realize it, but you're so tense, and then you come out, you start to relax, and all of a sudden you're exhausted. I mean, I gave evidence in the old. I gave one evidence at the Old Bailey.
Yeah,
a serial rape and 2 murders, and I don't even remember going home that night. I just kind of somehow wandered to the nearest tube station and wandered on. I mean, I don't recall when my brain just wasn't. I was like an automaton.
Yeah,
my brain was just mush.
Yeah. I can imagine. So we kind of like, it's fun to kind of cover the you're on the stand, that kind of stuff. Let's go back a little bit before then. So let's, you were using the example of bank robbers and things like that back in the day. A case drops in your lap. Let's say, we'll use that. Let's say it is a bank robbery. Where do you come in the investigation? So what is your talk me through your role and what you would do with that sort of job?
Okay, I mean, bank robbery is not that common these days, but they do occasionally occur. What would happen is that you wouldn't tend to go to the scene of a bank robbery. Occasionally you might if it's a shooting. But
let's say there's a shooting. Okay,
well, I'm not a firearms expert, but a firearms expert might go to the scene to try and figure out where the shots were fired from. If the bullets have ricocheted, they might want to go and calculate some trajectories and say, well, this is where the shot was fired from. And then and if they've not found the bullet might be over here, and this is where the bullet is, and so on. My area was more in armed robberies, was around body fluids. Blood, textile fibers, hairs, so it was all that trace evidence. The clothing would come into the lab with a kind of narrative about the case, some kind of idea of where to begin. The first thing I would do would be to pick up the phone and talk to somebody who was involved in it and say, right, okay, because very often in the course of a couple of days, things can change quite a lot. So they might send it into the lab. They might send it into the lab, and somebody gets injured at the scene, and they've arrested one person. They know there's more than one person involved. Well, within 48 hours, so the files with me have got one person in custody, but within 48 hours, they might have another 2 in custody.
Right.
I don't know that yet. There's always a bit of a lag time. So the first thing to do is pick up the phone, understand what people are saying, understand what people admit to or deny. Pretty much in these roles, everybody denied everything. But if they said, I was wearing that balaclava, the point going over the top trying to prove well in the balaclava because they've admitted wearing it. So there's a tension that you've got. You to basically the focus is to find science that answers questions that's relevant to the investigation.
Yeah.
So
How does
who was the? Go on.
I was gonna say, how does it get complicated when you say that someone's wearing a balaclava and they admit to it straight away? How does that complicate an investigation, or can that, if we know they are a suspect, maybe they are someone who actually did do something, and they're admitting to wearing that thing, as are they using that as like a shield to like avoid getting getting hung for the
Well,
crime? Because, oh yeah, of course I wear that. It's
well,
mine.
yeah. Well, no. The basic explanation for that is that it then
Mhm.
negates any evidence you find on it.
Mm.
But if you've got other evidence, so for example, if you've got CCT of somebody who's 6'4" tall wearing a blue balaclava,
Yeah.
and then you find you find a balaclava at the crime scene or
Yeah.
nearby, because often they're dumped nearby, and then somebody
Yeah.
says, "Oh yeah, that's mine. I lost it the day before." Um, Admitting something like that is a way of negating evidence. Somebody
Yeah.
denies being at a crime scene, and you find their DNA there.
Yeah.
They're in trouble. They're going to have to come up with an explanation of
Yeah.
why their DNA was there. Most people will admit being at a crime scene. Well,
Mm.
I'm generalizing a lot here, obviously.
Yeah. Yeah.
Most people will admit being at a crime scene, but deny that that they were in a particular room or they carried out a particular act. Or they say, "Oh yeah, well I was there the day before. Of course, I was talking to her before. It's not I didn't kill her." You know.
Right.
But then the pathology might suggest that the victim was killed not that day, but before, or other circumstantial evidence might suggest, like, dated newspapers, or the fact that the victim hasn't accessed this in 24 hours might suggest that they were dead 24 hours previously. So there's all
Yeah.
those kind of complications. So it's quite a tricky course to navigate for
Yes.
someone who's accused. But one of the easiest ways to navigate it is to basically admit as much as possible, short of actually admitting the
Right.
crime. And
Yeah.
sometimes that works. Where it tends to not work, the classic one is, "Oh yeah, I dropped. For some reason, I'm talking about women here, but I was going to say most victims of murder are actually young men. But
Yeah.
"Oh yeah, I dropped him off at his house." So that was the last person to see them alive.
Yeah.
And then they disappeared. Again, all that can be reinvestigated. Now you need to know that story as a scientist to
Mhm.
kind of figure out what's doing and what isn't worth doing. Because the truth of the matter is that there's an awful lot of cops and there's not that many forensic scientists, and most forensic scientists are run off their feet. I mean,
Yeah.
when not the 70s, but in the when I at the peak of my busyness in London, let's say, and towards the end of the 80s,
Mm.
I can remember working on 6 murders all at once, and
Jeez.
half a dozen rapes and a couple of robberies.
Yeah.
So they're all going on at once. There's only one me,
Yeah.
but there's every one of them has got a dedicated investigation team,
Yeah.
and they're all looking for answers. I'm
Yeah.
not saying that's impossible, but that's the forensic scientist is a bottleneck in this process.
Yeah.
There are kind of rate limiting steps. So until, that's why it's so important that you establish that what you're doing is worthwhile. When I worked in Edinburgh, which was from about the late mid '89 to mid '90s, I reckoned a third of the work we were doing is a complete waste of time.
Wow.
Because the cops, they just saw us as somewhere to dump things. They didn't. There's very little dialogue about what needed doing, and that dialogue is absolutely critical.
Yeah.
Most of my dialogue when I worked where I sorted these things out in Edinburgh was with the Procurator Fiscal, because that's in the police investigate cases in Scotland, but the person who really calls the shots is the prosecutor. So if the police haven't done something the prosecutor wants, they just say, "I need you to go back and do that." So I would phone them and say, "What do you want me to do?" I would essentially, for the most part, ignore the cops. Some of the cops were very good, but a lot of them weren't very good.
Yeah.
So the guys who weren't very good just gave me 100 items and said, get on with it. I would immediately phone the procurator fiscal and say, what I need to do here is important.
Yeah.
And they would say, they would give me the sort of information like, well, he admits being at the crime scene and being with the victim, but what he doesn't admit stabbing them, say. And then you think, okay, I'm looking for blood and clothing. We're looking for fingerprints, weapon, and stuff like that. So you focus it down immediately.
I suppose kind of a slight pivot, but on the same point is you advise you haven't advised writers and stuff like that in the past, and I know I brought you on to the CWA a long time ago for a really interesting chat about your work. And the CWA, for anyone listening, is the Crime Writers Association in the UK. So kind of looking at like fiction, I love crime fiction. I don't read a lot of police procedural stuff, but I do like a good number of it. I like a good Ian Rankin novel. But there's a lot of, for anyone who doesn't know, I guess in the States it's the same. There's a bunch of cop shows, whether that's the shows like Elementary or Castle, or over here there's things like Luther and Blue Lights, and that show with the people who do the cold cases. I can't remember what that one's called, but everyone liked that one. I didn't, but a lot of people did.
Actually, that's the ones I liked, if it's the case.
Yeah.
Is that the one with Nicola?
I think so. Line of Duty. Yeah. I think it's called Line of Duty.
No, I don't like Line of Duty. I couldn't. Yeah, I couldn't be.
I might be getting that mixed up, and I'm sure someone in the comments is going to be like, that's not the show you're talking about. But anyway, it's fine. But
there are some very good cop shows, but there's an awful lot of not so good ones, I think.
So I think what's interesting to me is I understand, so you mentioned earlier that your role is kind of like a bottleneck, and you've got a lot of work going on, which means in some ways, it sounds like you've probably stretched rather thin. And a lot of shows and books, they sort of rush the forensic stuff. It's sort of, there's that cliche of, oh, can you rush this for me? And okay, fine, I'll have it done for you in a couple of hours. So I guess what's interesting to me is what's your take on the function of the role of forensics within fiction, and where are you okay with it maybe bending reality for the sake and speed of a story, or where does it sort of, in your opinion, maybe break a story too much?
Well, I have to say I'm kind of spectacularly indifferent to this issue because writing fiction, I have advised quite a few authors.
Yes.
On some particular set of facts that usually quite small.
Yeah.
It's usually a detail about Often I get about pathology, and I'm not a pathologist, so there's always a caveat, which is I'm not a pathologist, but I'm fairly sure this is the answer. Rigor mortis comes in so many hours and disappears in so many hours, that I know that kind of stuff. So, but if I say you want detail, you need to find a pathologist to give you a detailed answer. Now, I don't watch that much crime fiction. There is some good crime fiction. I mean, the classic ones are things like Wire and kind of Breaking Bad. And I mean, I'm going back a long way now. There are some. The one that we were talking about, the cold case one, I thought the first series of that was great. I loved that. But I then realized when I watched the next one, I didn't even watch one in the next series because I thought, I've seen all this. It's exactly the same formula. That was character driven as far as I could see. And of course, lots of these things are character driven. I find the repetitive use of the same kind of character a bit more tedious and annoying than getting the forensics wrong. The problem with forensic work, unless you want to be super clever about it, is that it kind of undoes all the kind of classic kind of plots, doesn't it? I mean, if you pull together DNA and digital evidence and basically physical forensic evidence, it doesn't leave many gaps in a story that for you to manipulate, because that's what you're doing. I mean, okay, my take on this, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, is that the trick of that kind of book, the kind of whodunit puzzle type book, is to simply not reveal a critical piece of information, but not reveal to the reader, not let the reader realize that is critical. They just pass over it because you've drawn their attention to something else.
Yes.
And then you then reveal that later on. And I'm not saying that isn't, I mean, that can be very clever sometimes, but I suspect very often it's not that clever. It's about structure and planning.
Yeah.
I mean, there was a time when I used to kind of write, throw the remote control across the room when I saw some of this stuff, but it doesn't bother me that much now because it's just entertainment. I mean, if it's ludicrous, then I'm not interested in that. It's quasi-realistic, then that's all it needs to be, isn't it? It just needs to be enough for your average reader, and I am not your average reader, to be, sucked into the alternative reality. Fiction is an alternative reality, isn't it? That's what it is. You're making this stuff up. It just has to be suitably plausible, certain kind of reader. So I guess the key thing is that you know your reader. Yeah. You know what kind of reader you're going for. But I'm trying to think of there was a great show which wasn't a forensic show, which I loved. That was brilliant. Now it had who's the guy that was in The Office and then played? Did he play Frodo? Martin?
Oh, Martin Freeman. Yes,
Martin Freeman. He was in a show about a kind of beat cop.
Yeah, The Responder, wasn't it? Is that it?
Yeah, that was brilliant. That was absolutely brilliant, I thought.
So what worked about that show for you? That's what I'm interested in. What made that work for you then?
It just exposed the kind of people that cops deal with, the kind of compromises they have to make, lives they have to lead, the culture that they work in, and just exposed all that. How he got. I mean, I'm not suggesting that that's what every cop experiences, of course not. But it just shows you how that if you work on the edge of criminality, you can get sucked into criminality.
Right.
It's not quite Breaking Bad, the kind of Shakespearean good guy becomes devil. But most. I mean, there's a phrase, an academic phrase that's used, which I think really sums this kind of thing up, particularly old style policing. Particularly, I was talking about the flying squad, and I don't even know if there is still a flying squad in the Met anymore, but the flying squad have always had a terrible reputation for corruption. And there is a phrase in academic policing literature called noble cause corruption. This is when a cop knows who did it. They know who did it. Now, they may or may not actually know, but in their mind, they did it. That then justifies the next steps that they take, like planting evidence or fitting somebody up or whatever. It's a kind of distorted sense of justice.
Yes.
And that still exists. I'm not suggesting that it's rife, but you only have to look at the Met now to see what the state it's in terms of history of it. And I came to the conclusion when I finished my last book that I must have been a useful idiot on more than one occasion in some cases where I found evidence and gave evidence and it was planted. It's almost impossible to conclude otherwise.
Yeah. What can you give me an example of that? Because I find I was going to ask that earlier. Like how can planting evidence thwart, and how do you recognize that? Because I find that quite interesting.
Okay, let me give you the starkest and most ludicrous situation that I've come across. I haven't come across what I believe to be planting evidence very often.
Right.
I mean, literally less than the fingers I have in one hand.
Okay.
But if you're dealing with trace evidence, all you have to do is take two
Yes.
items of clothing and rub them together. I wouldn't know.
Yes.
I would have no idea. But I once did a case in Edinburgh, and this was you really couldn't make this up. So there's a kind of case of, I think it was a kind of case of domestic violence, essentially, but it was an attack at home. Whether the gender of the victim, I don't recall, but I think it was a woman. The person accused was a man, and the weapon was a Welsh love spoon. Right, it's going to get sillier, so get ready for it. Yeah, so a Welsh love spoon is a kind of wooden carved ornate spoon that you hang up on the wall. You don't use it as a spoon. It's the size of a
My grandparents
spoon.
had that for some reason.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. And so that was the weapon.
Yeah.
Presumably fists as well and other things, but that's a bit. And in those days, the label, because you have to have a label on an item, it has to be, because that then is your reference, and that's what is used in court. The label was tied onto these items. It was tied onto these items in Scotland with a piece of string. So, if it was a knife, there would be a piece of string around it. Actually, a knife's a bad example because knives are too dangerous to do that with. But an item of clothing, you would tie the label through the back of the label of the item of clothing. So the label is tied onto this love string, and underneath the string, held in place by the string, is a tuft of human head hair. Right. And I think you're having a laugh. This is what? It's not a tuft of hair that's been pulled out of somebody's head where all the roots are at one end.
Right.
It's a kind of clump of hair that you might find when your teenage daughter has spent the last 4 hours brushing her hair, and it's a kind of clump of hair lying on the carpet. Right? So this is only there because that string is holding it there.
Right.
There is no way on earth that is there. Right?
Yeah.
So I go to my boss. My boss was a real star. He said, well, it's nothing to do with me. You need to sort it out. He's the head of the lab. He was in Egypt, mind you, so I didn't expect much more than that. So I then went to the head of CID and said, I really like this. And he said, look, this is all wrong. We can't be doing with this. It doesn't work for anybody. It's not in the interests of us or anybody else to plant evidence. I'll sort it out. He picks the phone up. I'll be fantastic, sorted, brilliant. I go up to the lab, which is a couple floors up, and somebody then says about 10 minutes later, there's a phone call for you. I pick it up, and it's the cop in the case. So even the head of CID has just phoned the cop and said, you need to sort this out with Fraser.
Oh, right.
He's not said, Fraser said this is planted, what's going on.
Yeah.
It's just said, you need to sort this out. So he's handed the problem back to me. So this cop turns up at the lab. And it's just completely bizarre. Right? He's basically saying, oh, yeah, well, that's how I found it. Well, what? And then I said, what? So you saw the hair on there when you picked this up? And he said, well, no, because the lights weren't on and it was dark. And I'm thinking, well, it's just getting more and more stupid by the minute. It was dark. So you found it in the dark, and you tied the label around it in the dark, and that held the hair on it. And I thought, oh, no. And off he went. And I thought, I don't know what to do now. And in the past, I had a tactic. This is back to your idea of, kind of learning the craft. Yeah. When you get, one of the ways you can deal with problems like that is that you just, normally when you describe items that you get in the lab, it's fairly superficial. It's just enough to let people know that this is a knife or a pair of jeans or a cup or a, whatever. So in this instance, I described it in a lot of detail. This was a Welsh love spoon. On the Welsh love spoon, held in place by the string label, was a tuft of hair. Described the hair, all that in my report. Hoped I would never hear about it again. Yeah. And of course, a few months later, I get a phone saying, oh, you're needed at Edinburgh High Court, which is the equivalent to the Crown Court in London. I get the
Yep.
file and I thought, oh no, it's that case. But well, what can I do? You know, that's I've done my best. I've went to the head of the lab. I've went to the head of CID, and they're not helping me. I'm going to have to say in court if the question is such, yeah, I think this is planted. I get into court, and they go through all the items, and then they skip over that one, and I think, oh, leaving it. Oh no, they're leaving it to the end. They go, you know, another classic aspect of court is they leave the interesting bit right to the very end.
Yeah.
You know, and then you think you've an easy time, then all of a sudden they kind of fire this question at you. They're leaving it to the end, and then we get to the end of all the other items, and the prosecutor just sits down, and the defence just saying no questions. And of course, what had happened was, I'm guessing now, is the prosecutor went to the defence, or the defence went to the prosecutor and said, "You use that as evidence, and I will basically cross-examine Fraser about how that got there, because it's quite clear he believes this is okay."
Yeah.
And they obviously both agreed to just drop it. So it turned out that all this anxiety was about nothing. But so that's one example of a tiny number of instances where I felt there was contamination. And it was, I mean, again, a story you couldn't make up. Frankly, it was just ludicrous. How the cop thought he was going to get away with it, I can't imagine. It wasn't a cop I knew. I'd never worked with him before.
Yeah, but so then what happened to the cop? Did he get caught? What happened to him?
Yeah, nothing happened to him. I can't imagine anything happened to him.
What was his motive for planting the evidence?
Let me go on to another case which is much more serious. Okay, so almost the very first. I moved from London to Edinburgh. Almost the very first time I gave evidence in court, the guy in the dock was a cop, and he was in the dock because of me. Because basically, I just told it like it was. I just said, "No, you didn't send me on that date. You sent me on another date," and it caused a huge fuss. The case was dropped for the moment, reconvened. He was charged with something. I gave evidence against him.
Jeez.
And then later on, the case came back into court. Now, again, I'm talking about these things as if they happen all the time. That was enormously... And I have here, because that will... This is a copy of my file. And when I went in, stood in the witness box, normally they would give you what they call productions in Scotland, what they call exhibits in England. So an item of clothing, is this the item you... Item maybe one, you know, is this the knife? Yes. So the first item I was handed in the witness box was my own file. This was the evidence in the case.
Oh my gosh!
And because of that, I've got a copy of the file, which is unusual.
Right. Oh, that's
fun. This is a copy of my original file with all my original notes and all the rest of it, because it was an exhibit in case.
Right. Yeah. Oh, I love that. I guess I need to kind of start wrapping up here, but it's just a couple more questions. Yeah. So, you know, you've worked on a lot of different cases. Some, you know, and you know, as you mentioned earlier, that kind of you finished a trial once and you don't even remember getting home. So I do sort of wonder about the kind of the mental and physical strain of investigations, and how do you, I suppose, how do you, what tactics or you know whatnot do you have to cope with the stress of it, you know? Like, do you detach yourself from it? Like, how do you detach yourself, I guess, and remain sane?
Yeah, well, I mean, the stress on scientists is nothing like as much as it is on cops.
Sure, sure.
Because you're usually one step removed. That depends, though, because, for example, when I worked for Kent Police, sometimes I wasn't one step removed. Sometimes I was there at the crime scene doing the work as well. How do you deal with this? The kind of example or the analogy I always use is healthcare workers or paramedics, you know, doctors, nurses. These are people dealing with horrible things day in, day out.
Yeah.
Arguably more horrible than I experienced, because this is going to sound horrible. I'm going to say it anyway. At least the bodies I'm looking at are dead.
Yeah.
They're not dying. They're not dying slowly
Yeah.
in front of me.
Yeah.
By the time I get there, they're dead. Now, there is one exception to that, and it's children. And there is something that the body of a dead child does that is kind of
Yeah.
it just cuts into something that you can't quite protect.
Yeah.
So my answer is that you're too busy. You're so busy focused on the job
Mm.
to get too engaged in the heavy emotion.
Mm-hmm.
That's not to say it never arises. And my take on it, looking back 4 decades, is, and I think maybe some young senior investigators and forensic scientists should think about this, is I think there is always a price to pay for this. I don't mean it's caused me. I don't mean it's keeping me awake at night or it's caused me enormous stress or whatever. I don't think you know what it's doing to you because you see a very graphic version of the world that most people are very happy not to see and very happy to engage with it via crime fiction because it means them cozy up to it and then walk away from it. And if you're in it, you can't walk away from it and you have to live with it. I think to one degree or another, everybody who does that pays some kind of price. It might be in your relationships, it might be in your family, it might be in your future work, it might be in your mental health. I just don't think you can do that for like 3 or 4 decades in the same way. It's not coincidence that cops only work for 30 years and have to retire. And they take the stress much higher for cops because they're dealing with all this. They just deal with human mayhem and madness every day of the week. So it's about doing your job, remaining sufficiently detached, not totally detached. And kind of managing any consequences that arise from it. I mean, I do know one guy I worked with who is my deputy started to have flashbacks about a case he was involved in.
Oh wow!
And that's a classic sign of PTSD. And sure enough, within 18 months, he was out of the job, and it was very painful going for me and for him because he was my deputy. So I think there is a price to pay, and I think you have to figure out how you pay that price.
No, I can imagine, man. That's
as you do in many other stressful and difficult roles. As say, healthcare is a good example.
Yes, it's true. This has been fantastic. I've really enjoyed this conversation, Jim. So thanks for coming on and walking me through all the ins and outs that we could get into. For anyone who doesn't know, you have some books out there, including Forensic Science and Murder Under the Microscope, which are both fantastic. Are you working on anything now? Is anything new coming out? What are you doing?
I've got one book which is The Agents at the minute, which is about a huge UK operation to look for serial killers. So I'm still waiting to get some developments on that. It's the largest UK search for serial killers that's ever taken place, and there's pretty much nothing out there on it. And I've got loads of primary materials, and I had some direct involvement in it. And then the next book I plan to write after that, I'm assuming that I'm going to get one published when I find a publisher. Will be about being an expert witness. What we started talking about in the opening of the session, what it's like to actually be an expert, to be in court, dealing with lawyers, dealing with cops, walking that line. Because an expert, without taking too much time, cops are allowed to be advocates. Lawyers are allowed to be advocates. Witnesses are witnesses. They're allowed to be advocates. They say what they saw. Expert witnesses are allowed to express an opinion, but that opinion is for the benefit of the court. So if you work for the police, your duty is to the court. And all I'll say is that's quite a tricky line to walk.
Yes.
It causes a lot of tension and a lot of difficulty in various relationships where people want you to say one thing and you realize that you can't say that. The evidence means something else. So that's what I'm hoping to write about, 2 books down the line.
I mean, both of these sound fantastic. I hope both of them come out quickly, because I would love to read both of those.
I don't think they'll be out quickly, notwithstanding my desire to do so. I don't know about you, but I find the writing process quite protracted and difficult.
I do, actually. Yeah, I have I say great ideas. Not, they're ideas that I like, that I have, and I try to put them on paper, and it does take a while. I'm not a fast writer. I wish I was. I need to get better if I can. But yeah, I tend to write slowly for some reason.
Yeah. But it's the old adage, cliche. It's 5% inspiration and 95% perspiration. It's the ideas. My ideas come to me easily. Actually converting the ideas into something that somebody's willing to publish and others are willing to read is where the slog is, and where the skill is, arguably.
Yes. Yeah. So for people who might want to look you up online, where can people find you? Or you're on social media, but
if you search for Jim Fraser, you'll pick my website up.
Yep.
You'll pick up my academic website as well as my personal website. That will give you some links to some my books, some of our other work that I've done. What it won't give you links to, because I've not got around to doing it yet, is in a couple of years, I've done about 20 TV programs. So there's lots of stuff on broadcast media. And I've got a podcast out this week, which I haven't listened to yet. I was interviewed about, which is the Gareth Williams case, the MS guy who was. Yes. So that's on BBC right now. So I was interviewed for that. So I assume I'm in there somewhere.
Nice. Also, for anyone listening on Spotify or Apple, there will be links to Jim's websites and books in the description. Same with if you're watching on YouTube. So all that will be there, or a good number of things will be there for you to track Jim down and his work. And it's worth looking into if you have an interest in forensic science, or you're writing crime fiction or some sort of story that involves this kind of stuff. His resources are incredibly helpful. But yeah, this was a lot of fun. Hope to bring you back. There's loads of other ideas I have that I could bring you back for. So hopefully we can do that.
I'd be very happy to do it. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. Okay. And everyone, thanks for tuning in, and I will see you next week.
The Secret Circle.